Over the past few hours, I've read every single Wikileaks document that mentions Primitivo Mijares, and I want to talk about some of what I learned in this video, as well as introduce the first two chapters of his book, The Conjugal Dictatorship, which exposes the Marcos administration from the inside. Primitivo Mijares is a very controversial character. Maybe it's not obvious that he is, but from what I'm reading about him, he seems to be a very strange character. Even his death is still a mystery. In the last video, I said that he was presumably kidnapped and murdered, but the more I read about it, the more it's a bit more complicated or confused. It's more of a mystery than it is obvious that that's the case. Before you read any book about politics, it's very important to understand who is writing it, because in politics, it's very difficult to be objective, if not impossible. And so it's important to know what the biases of the author are, what their political orientations are, if they may have any hidden motives, so that when you read the book, this is not to discredit whatever is being written, but it helps you better understand and better know how to process what you're reading and where you should have grains of salt. Now, from what I understand, a lot of what he exposes about Marcos has been proven to be true, but this does not exactly absolve him of his character, of who he was and what kind of person, and his kind of responsibility for creating a lot of the problems in society at the time. Primitivo Mijares was a journalist who worked for the Manila Chronicle, which is a newspaper owned by Eugenio Lopez Sr. of the Lopez family clan. And he at the time also owned ABS-CBN. He started ABS-CBN, and he also, I think, was the president of Meralco. He was a very popular figure, and within the country, he was looked at as the president maker. He was so powerful, again, that if you're on his good side, he will, he will create your president kind of track for you. According to Mijares, while he was working for Lopez, he convinced him that Marcos is worth supporting, because Marcos had the potential to be the president of the country and even beat Diosdado Macapagal. So according to him, he was the one who is responsible for Lopez supporting Marcos and eventually making Marcos be the president. From 1963, he described himself as working closely with Marcos. But only in 1972 that he officially works under Marcos as his chief propagandist for the country, while writing for the daily newspaper, The Daily Express, where he would write a daily column justifying martial law to the Philippine people, making them feel that martial law was a good idea and that the Philippines was thriving. It's weird to know this, because how can you read something knowing that the person is a master at propaganda? His job is a propagandist. It means he is good at manipulating your emotions, believing whatever he wants you to believe. For his job for very many years, it was promoting Marcos. He was one of the biggest supporters of Marcos. He's one of the most important people in the spread of Marcos's ideology. When that is your job, when that is your skill set, it's difficult to necessarily read something that you write and see it as it is. Just because of that's who you are, or that's what you're good at, or that's what you've done for several years. So I think it's important, again, to remember, and I'll continue to think about it as I continue reading the book, that he is a propagandist. This is what he's best at doing. Given that he's a propagandist, it makes me realize while reading the book that he is very much playing into American points of view. He is pretty much kissing up to America for the entirety of the first two chapters. I'll give you a sample of it. So the book opens up with him, of how it was like for him to finally go into DC and how he felt when he got asylum in the United States. And he describes visiting Washington, D.C. as, it's like, he says that it's for many Filipinos, it's like going to Mecca for Muslims. Again, he says the Mecca of the Filipinos is Washington, D.C. because it's like the holy birthplace of Philippine democracy, of democracy in general. And it's weird because I understand what he's trying to do. What he's trying to do is, if you're an American reading this, he wants the American person who's reading the book to be mad. He wants them to be on the side of the anti-Marcos coalition. And that doesn't mean that that's a bad point of view. This is probably a good thing, in a way, if what he's saying is true about the Marcos administration. But at the same time, it's important to, again, look at it and say, he's also being extra, he sounds like he's creating, pro-American propaganda as well. Or that's what he seems to have switched over to. It's weird. You can read it yourself. He spends several pages of sorts just going on and on about how beautiful America is. He says that Marcos, tampers with the sacred and hallowed American institutions, and that's why you should be mad about Marcos. Marcos is not bad because he is making Filipinos suffer. He's not bad because he is suppressing and repressing the Filipino people. He's bad because he is besmirching the legacy of the American institution as an idea, as a concept, as a historical kind of force. That's the argument he's making in the first two chapters, and it's a weird one, because what I learned from reading the WikiLeaks documents is that what became a big deal was not that Marcos was corrupt. What became a big deal was that he was bribed by Marcos not to testify in court about, in a trial about him. Because a lot of the focus seems to be weirdly not on Marcos's problems, but on the fact that Marcos would dare subvert democracy by bribing someone who could be a witness in court. And I don't know, it's just like a weird way to frame the issue, because there's so many problems in the Philippines that may have come not just because of of Marcos, but because of Mijares himself. He was responsible for many of the issues and propagating this campaign, this presidency, and so he has a lot of responsibility on his hands, of which he is trying to fix with this book. But I don't know, it's just strange to see it framed in a way that minimizes the sufferings of the Filipino people, which maybe when we get to read more of the book we'll learn more about those issues. I still think maybe we'll get there, but for the first two chapters it's framed in a way that makes it seem like the problem is not that Marcos is a bad dictator to the Filipino people specifically, and that they have specific issues that he is not allowing to be fulfilled and not allowed to be kind of alleviated, but that Marcos tried to bribe him, therefore he is being bad to American democracy. This does not mean that it's untrue. It just means that I'm just found weird that's how we framed it. The idea is that Marcos, after he defected from the government and went to the United States for asylum, Marcos, through an envoy, contacted him and said that they tried to bribe him with $50,000. We'll give you $50,000 not to testify in court, and we'll give you another $50,000 if you leave the U.S. and move to Australia with your brother. Now, what they didn't know, what the Marcos administration did not know, was at the time he was already in touch with the FBI. He knew perhaps he was going to be bribed, and so he got all the documentation ready. He contacted journalists so that when he was being bribed, everything was well documented, and so that it could be published in newspapers. And so what became more embarrassing for Marcos was not just that he defected, but that he was caught bribing him. Now, according to other reports in the future, later on, it seems that Mijares was actually already receiving bribes from Marcos before this $50,000 bribe, this $100,000 bribe. He was apparently already receiving smaller bribes from Marcos even before that, which were later found out in court. But I guess that's not necessarily in the frame of this book, but just to kind of contextualize it, he was actually already apparently getting bribes from Marcos. So it seems like there was like rumors that he was kind of, or there's like other perspectives where it seems like he was both allowing himself to get money, and while also he was like backstabbing Marcos and backstabbing the U.S. by playing both sides. That's one way of looking at it. And one of the things I was wondering while reading the book was, why is he defecting at this moment in time? Because if he was a big part of justifying martial law for several years, if he was the biggest proponent of Marcos, he was his Joseph Goebbels. He described himself as like Goebbels, the propagandist of Hitler, the second most powerful person, or maybe even the first most powerful person in Nazi Germany. That's how he describes himself. If he, is in this position where he was really that involved in what was going on in the Philippines, why is he only defecting 4 years, 5 years later? The WikiLeaks documents shed some light on this, but again, I don't want to necessarily say this is all true, but this is what documents say, that I don't think we see much on how we talk about this book, but it's important to understand his legacy. According to the United States government in classified documents at the time, when Mijares defected, he was already in. People were not seeing him in a good light in the Philippines because there were allegations of him. he seemed to be a big gambler, and he was spending a lot of money, Philippine money, gambling in Las Vegas. I think in Las Vegas he gambled around $50,000. He was accused of raping, I think it was a Philippine consular's secretary or something. So he had rape accusations against him. He had this corruption allegations against him and gambling. According to his own family, when he was working for Marcos, his family was living a lavish life. He was making lots of money from working for Marcos. And so during this time, apparently, according to the U.S. government's classified details, he seems to have gotten on the bad side of Cocoy Romualdez, who was the brother-in-law of Marcos. And around this time, so he got on the bad side of Cocoy Romualdez. He got gambling allegations with the Philippine money. He had rape allegations against him. There's one thing about how he may have stolen $7,000 from Imelda Marcos or something, but there were many of these things that were building up, and he was apparently looked at in the Philippines as this traitor of sort of someone who you couldn't trust or put much stock in. And so he I guess while his political star seemed to have been fading, that's when he decided to defect. And he went to the U.S. And again, when you realize that he was also getting bribes from Marcos even before he officially came forward with the other bribes, it makes you think a lot about him and who he was. But that does not necessarily say that what he says is untrue. But it says that, to me, that he was not a hero. Because when you read the book, the tone of the book so far is that he is writing himself as this big hero, that he is sacrificing everything that he has in his life in order to make the Philippines a better country. But in some way, it feels more like it's some kind of personal revenge or vendetta. He seems to have had many vendettas against the administration and against Marcos and his family. And he seems to look at himself as some kind of heroic, saintly figure. And this is really evident when you read how he describes himself in the book. And I don't know, it just feels to me like someone who was in that position for so long, who was very aware of all the issues. And again, many of the issues that he points about Marcos's administration, like such stuff like bombing super malls, killing people that are innocent so they can blame it on the communists, or fake bombing in Riola's car, or having the 1969 elections being the dirtiest elections in Philippine history. All of this stuff he knew. He knew there were innocent people being killed, the left being indiscriminately blamed. He knew that rampant corruption was going on. All of this happened before he decided to become the chief propagandist of the Marcos administration in 1972. Again, he only became the chief propagandist on the year of martial law. So, and he worked there for 3 years. So it's a weird thing, But this does not mean that what he'll say, what we'll learn from his expose later on, is false. It just means that I don't think he's a good person. And I think we need to consider that he was a propagandist while reading this book as it goes along. It's very likely that many things he says in the book is very true. But again, I feel like we should temper our understanding of him and his character. The book is filled with lots of hyperbole and exaggeration as well that I think is important to consider. Because I think it's part of his rhetoric. He's trying to get on the good side of the United States, and he's trying to prop up his image of the U.S. Right? He's looking the U.S. is literally he describes America as this holy place, and describes Marcos in different passages, comparing him to Mao Zedong, comparing him to Castro, comparing him to Hitler, comparing him to Mussolini, to Stalin, to Peron, even to, for some reason, the anarchist, Mikhail Bakunin. He says that Marcos is trying to expand his empire in Southeast Asia at a time when the United States was very wary of, the domino theory of communism kind of spreading throughout Southeast Asia. He described Marcos as running the Philippines as if he was a communist and that he was trying to expand his empire in Southeast Asia, which I'm a bit, I don't know. I don't think that's probably, probably not true that Marcos was trying to create an empire in Southeast Asia, or that he had any kind of ability to do so. But he strangely describes the Philippines as being run like a communist country, and all this stuff. So this guy Primitivo Mijares, he describes himself also as saying that martial law was a good idea to minimize communist threat. But his problem with the administration was not that he doesn't think that the communist threat was real. His problem was that he thinks that Marcos was benefiting too much from it because he ended up using it as a way to just keep accumulating power, which is probably it's a true problem that I think we really need to consider and think about. But again, I don't know. These are just my thoughts in the first two chapters, and I'm excited to learn about the specifics of what Marcus does later on when I continue reading the book.